This week I thought we'd take a look at a really useful tool that helps with the development of ASP.NET Web API applications, which is Swagger. And Swagger allows us to look at the endpoints of our web service, our RESTful web service, and see what's going on. So let's take a look at the application I've put together here. And it's just a very simple application in terms of a web service returning book reviews. So I've already got an SQLite database with a few book reviews in there. I've got this idea of a book review that just has the ID, the title, and the rating. I've got an entity framework DB context. I've got a repository with an interface that gives us access to the SQLite repository that accesses the DB context. And then I've got a controller with all of the endpoints you'd expect. So there's a get all, there's a get by ID, and then the next one I've got is a summary. So it takes all of the book reviews, multiple reviews for each book, and gives you an average for each book. We did this in a video a while back if you want to take a look at that just to see the logic behind that. But then I've also got a post to create a new book review, I've got a put to modify a book review, and I've got a delete to delete one. So just the normal operations you'd have with a RESTful web service. And if I run it up, then it takes us just straight to the controller, to the get all, and we can see there's the JSON we have for all of those books. You'll notice I've got a little plugin in Chrome here that just lays it out a bit more neatly. If I switch to raw, that's what we're actually receiving, but it can be quite useful to do that. And obviously we can also access the get by ID. So if I put, say, /3 in there, then we just get persuasion. And also we can get that summary, which gives us the average for all those books. So Dr. No 2.67, Emma 4.5, etc. It doesn't really matter about the detail. But in terms of using a browser to test a RESTful API, that's about as far as you can go, because typing into the address bar, all you can do is send GET requests. You can't manipulate the other verbs, the post, the put, and the delete that we've already got. And that's where you need some other kind of tool. Now, there are tools available like Postman, which is really good, that you can send off any request you like and use the precise verbs, add headers, add bodies, everything like that. And that can be quite useful. But what Swagger does is actually builds that into our application for us. So let's take a look at how we can do that. Now, the normal way that you'd probably do this is straight out of the box. So if you create a new project and go for an ASP.NET Web API application, click next on that and on that, then you get this option in here for enable open API support. And that's what turns these features on in the generated project. I should point out the distinction really between Open API and Swagger. Open API is a set of standards that supports this information we get from web services, and Swagger is a set of tools that exploit that standard to give us the information. There are other tools there, but Swagger is the biggest one and certainly the one we have here. But I'm not going to just create a project. I'm going to integrate this into an existing project just so we can see the details of what there are. So what we need to do is, in our project, we need to add a couple of NuGet packages. So what we've got to add is one called Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.OpenAPI. So we'll put that one in. And then also we need this Swashbuckle.ASP.NET Core that will give us the other feature we need. So those two packages go in there. And then in our program where we're doing the configuration, we have to make a couple of changes. So we have to, when we're adding the services, we're going to say builder.services.add Swagger gen. And then when we're configuring the pipeline, we have to say app.use Swagger and app.use Swagger UI. We may come to the options there in a later video, but for now, we'll just use the basic one. Now, actually, you'll quite often see these two wrapped in an if app.environment.isDevelopment, so that we only get these Swagger features generated when we're developing, not when we're in a production build. That is sometimes a good idea, but there's plenty of situations where the information that you're exposing to help people use your Web API interface is just as helpful for people using your production site as well as when you're doing development. So I wouldn't say it's an absolute rule. I'd certainly see plenty of situations where you present this to your end users as well as just as to internal developers. Last thing we've got to do is just make sure that now when we launch the application, instead of going to the book review controller endpoints directly, we go to Swagger. So we have to go to our launch settings, and in whichever profiles we want, I'll do it in all of them, where we've got the launch URL there as book reviews for the book reviews controller, we just change that to Swagger. So in there, and in there, and in there. And now when we run that, we see we're getting the Swagger information for each of the endpoints we had on our controller. So remember, we put in the get all, the get one, the get for a summary, and the put, the post, and delete, and those are all there now. And this makes life much easier. We can click on there and we can do try it out. And if I just click execute, then we get the same information we saw in the browser, but we can see it all listed there in Swagger. We can see what the response header was like. If we go down and do something like the get by ID, then we're prompted for a parameter of type int32 for the ID. So if we type an ID in there and execute that, we get back just the one of them, and we can see the response code and that sort of thing. So immediately, just by putting Swagger in there, we're getting lots and lots of useful features. And moreover, we can do things like the post and the put and the delete using the other verbs. And you can see it's even giving us some useful information, such as telling us what the format of the data we need to pass in there. So if we do a post to create a new one, we can put in there, let's have a title of Dr. No and a rating of 5. And if we execute that, we get back the result of 201, which is created. We can see that it's given it the new ID of 11, and it also shows us there the full path to it, which is going to be book reviews /11. And so, in fact, if we just went to that, then we'd see there we've got our new one, Dr. No. So it's pretty good, but it's still lacking a lot of information that would be useful to somebody who's trying to use this RESTful API and doesn't really know what the details of what's going on are. For example, when we look at something like our get summary, the only information we've got there is that it will possibly return a 200 success. We're not being told what the format of the data coming back may be. It's all rather limited. And so what we really need to do is to start putting in that information, that metadata, as part of our controller code. So let's do that. So let's go to our controller now and start adding some more information. And the first thing we'll do is we can start adding information about what's being returned from this. So here, in all of these examples, I've just used the interface action result. And then you can see here, we're doing something like returning an OK, but there's no strong typing on the return type. So something we can do is change that from an action result to an action result that specifies the actual return type of the data. And in this case, it's going to be IEnumerable of this book review entity. Now, that really does nothing in terms of the actual code. It'll still work in exactly the same way. But now that's more information that can be used to build up the Swagger interface. And so now when we run that and we take a look at our get, now we can see that it's telling us the example. You can also have a look at the schema there, which is what it's listing there. So that's showing us what the structure looks like. But the example is probably a bit easier. There it's showing us that we're getting an array for the square brackets of these objects with an ID, a title and a rating. You'll also see down the bottom it's given us that information available as well. So immediately, just by putting that type on there, we're getting additional information. So what we should really do is, as much as possible, go through all of those and put that on there. So our get for a single item is going to be an action result just of book review, no IEnumerable. For the summary, that's again going to be the IEnumerable because we're returning a collection of them. For the post, well, what the post does is, we saw, it returns the new ID of the book review that's been created. And so in that case, that's actually going to be an action result for int, because we're using an int as the ID. So that's what we can put in there. For the put and the delete, we're not really returning any information beyond the fact of either an OK or a not found. So we're returning a status code, but no actual data. So those we can leave, I think, the same. But now if we run that up, we'll see that on each of those, so if we look at the post, you can see that it's telling us that the return will just be an int, and there's the example of it. You can see on the get one that it's telling us that the return will be a single book review item, and so that's given us lots more information. But there's still more that we can add in there, because I also mentioned that we're not really being given full information about the status code. So you can see the responses, it just thinks the only thing we're going to get back is a 200 success. And if I try this out and put in a valid ID, then of course we do get the 200 success, so that's fine. But if I put in an invalid ID, then it gets a bit confused. It gets back the 404 because remember that's what we were sending on the get if we didn't find it. But it also tells us it's undocumented, it doesn't know what's going on because we haven't specified in advance that 404 is one of the possible errors we can have here. So that's something else we can add. Now, what Swagger isn't clever enough to do is look inside our function in the controller and spot the possibilities that it's returning not found and okay. It can only look at what we're displaying externally in terms of the function specification. So it could use the return type, it can use the attribute for the parameter, but it can't look inside. So we've actually got to do a bit more on this. And so what we do is we add further attributes to specify the possible return type. So what we would do is use this attribute produces response type, and then we can specify the status code that it possibly can produce. So we're going to go for status codes dot and then status 200 OK. And then also when you've got something that actually returns data, as well as saying what the code is, you can specify the type of data that's being returned. So we're going to say type equals type of, and then in this case, remember, we're returning a single book review. And so although there's a bit of repetition there, because that's the same information that can be gleaned from the action result, it's probably a good idea to put that in there as well, just to keep things consistent. So that's our 200, our OK, and the result that we're passing in there. And then also the not found. So that's going to be a status of 404 not found. And that one doesn't have any kind of payload, so we can just get rid of that type of. But now when we run that one up, and we go to the get single, there we can see that now it's telling us that it could be a 200 or a 404 because those are the ones that are listed in there. And if we try that out now with an invalid one, then it gives us a 404, but it's no longer undocumented. It's giving us the correct information, and we can see the not found and a few other bits of information there. There is actually one other possible status we should worry about, because although we can't see it there, there is really always the possibility that there could be an exception thrown, and so you might get a 500 internal server error. You might want to put some clever exception handling around, but if you don't, then really we should be doing a produces response type and then have a status codes 500 internal server error. So that's giving it the full lot that we've got there. And let's go through the others and put them all on there. So on our get all, can't have a not found there, but you can have the internal server error conceivably. And also remember our return type is now an IEnumerable book review. Then if we move on to the summary, well, that's the same again as the get all. So you can't have a not found, but we're returning the IEnumerable book review. Then if we look at post, that can really only return two things. It can return the 500, but also it's doing a created, so we're going to change that to .201 created, and then we need to again specify the type of the payload, and remember we've already got that in the return type, so that's just going to be int in that case. Then on the put, here we've got the possibility with the not found or the OK or the 500, so that's the same as we've got here, so we can just steal that bit. And the only slight difference is the OK doesn't have a payload, so we get rid of that bit there. And in fact, the same will go for the delete. So that one, we can have a not found, or we can have an OK, or possibly a 500. So if we run that one up, we'll now see that we've really completed that, and that each one of these is giving us back full information as to what might happen. Success, not found, server error. If we look at the post, we can see that it's going to give us a created or a server error. And so lots of information. That means anybody now using this API knows what to expect, knows what possible errors or bad status codes they need to deal with, and how to cope with what our API is giving them. There's a few other things we might want to worry about there. Another type of error that can occur is if the payload that we send as part of the request isn't suitable. So if we just run that up again. So if we, for example, go to the post and click try it out, and let me just make a silly mistake. Let's change that rating to ranting. So that's clearly not going to work in terms of binding the JSON that we send onto the actual C# object, because that wants rating, not ranting. And so if we execute that, in that case, we get a 400 error. And that's a bad request telling us that the data we were sending was not in the appropriate format. And you can get some detail of that. You can see it was missing this idea of a rating. So that's what the 400's for. That wasn't a return that we actually put in there. So on our post, all we had there was the created code, but just like the 500, which isn't generated directly and obviously in here, we can still also get this 400 bad request. So let's pop that in there as well. And so we'll change that to a 400 bad request. That can also happen on a put because it's all to do with what we're sending in the payload. So put that one on there as well. And so if we run that up now and go to the post, only a small difference, but it's now telling us that this could return a 400 bad request. And therefore, if we do get something wrong, then it at least knows what to expect in terms of the error. There's one other status code that we might consider here. Now, you could go to huge lengths. It obviously depends on your particular application, what the status codes are. And I wouldn't be surprised if you miss some occasionally. But one that I consider here, let's just suppose that our payload is valid in terms of its format, but has problems in terms of its content. For example, we don't want to send off an empty title. The title has to have at least some text in there. And also the rules we have for our business logic are the rating has to be a number between 1 and 5. So we're going to need to reject posts and puts that don't have that rating and the title. So let's see how we can do that. So firstly, let's just put in a little bit of test code so we can check for that. So I'm going to put in a private bool validate review, and it'll take as a parameter one of these book reviews. And then all we need to do is return true or false whether it's valid. So we're going to say return. And then remember, the first thing we want to check for is that it's got something in the title. So we're going to say not string dot is null or white space book review dot title, and book review dot rating is greater than or equal to 1, and book review dot rating is less than or equal to 5. So that's our business logic in there. If we go down again to the two places where this can go wrong, so the post and the put, then what we're going to have to do, here's the post. So the book review object will have got this far because it will have managed to deserialize the JSON, but we've now got to say if not validate review, then in this case we're going to have to return and then another of these helper methods from the controller base class, unprocessable entity. And so we can simply say that something's gone wrong there. But of course that means we've also got to declare the status, which is 422, unprocessable entity. And then we can do exactly the same sort of thing on the put. So we'll add the extra status code and add the validation. And so now in either of those, if things go wrong, not only have we declared to the client that they might get back a 422, but we've put in the code so that it actually sends that back if we get things wrong. And so now, again, let's go to our post and try it out. And let's put in a rating of 6. Execute that. And there we get back our 422. And also in our list of possible codes, we've got the 422 listed there. So that's just a quick look at Swagger and how we can make our controller declare as much information as possible so that we can get that information in Swagger so that our clients can see it working. The actual API itself has not changed. It was working in just the same way before as it did after, apart from the addition of that validation check. So most of what we're doing there was all about declaring what we're doing, what data comes in, what data comes out, and what status codes come out. And it will make your API much, much more usable for your clients, whether you're doing that just during development or whether you expose that with the full production API. So I hope that was helpful. If you enjoyed it, do click like, do subscribe, and I'll see you next time.